Scott Lucas is the Professor of International Politics at Clinton Institute, University College Dublin, is now joining us live from Birmingham. Professor Scott Lucas, welcome to WION The World is One. How do you view the US and UK support for Israel while still urging the government to maintain caution in its quest to crush Hamas in Gaza? Some would call it doublespeak, given that the US has sent its ships to Israel. What do you think?
I'll let others make judgments, but I'll set out what has happened since the current cycle of conflict on October 7th, when Hamas went in with ground attacks and killed more than 1,000 Israeli civilians and foreign nationals. Not just the US and the UK, but much of the international community, often behind closed doors, said two things to the Israeli leadership. The first is, look, we agree with you that Hamas must be isolated and indeed pushed out of authority in Gaza. Indeed, Iran, the backer of Hamas, must be isolated. But from the very start, they added the second point to the Israelis, more of a question, which is, how are you going to do this? And what, again, the US, the UK, other European countries, Asian countries have said is an all-out military assault to, quote, destroy Hamas. In the words of Prime Minister Netanyahu, we don't think that will work. Not only do we think it's a military risky option, we think that instead of separating civilians from Hamas, you'll wind up driving civilians into the arms of Hamas as their only protector. And they've maintained that message for weeks, even as Israel has moved closer and closer and then launched the ground offensive a week ago. The fact of the matter is that if, at the end of the day, Benjamin Netanyahu and his fellow members of the war cabinet were dedicated to, quote, destroying Hamas, that meant they were going to unleash this bombing that would also kill many thousands of civilians. It meant that they would launch a ground offensive that could kill many thousands more. In other words, there's almost nothing the international community, including the United Nations, could do to stop Israel from carrying out those attacks. That's where we are right now. You know, with regret, I have to say, while understanding the need for Israel to defend itself, which is what, again, the international community said. We understand you have to defend yourself. For Israel to go on the offensive this way constitutes, and let's call it what it is, crimes against humanity. But crimes against humanity, which Benjamin Netanyahu thinks are entirely justified if it, one, saves his political future, and two, knocks out some and possibly most of Hamas's leadership.
Professor, diplomacy seems to be taking its course as much as the US is engaging with the Arab world, Palestine Authority, and also Israel. They are facing opposition from some quarters who say the US is not the recommended mediator in the conflict. With that in mind, who is the potential deal breaker in this war, in your view?
Well, again, let's deal with the reality of what's happening here. Turkey set itself up as a possible mediator in this conflict, but President Erdogan, who you mentioned, he no longer wants that role. He's trying, for domestic reasons, to build up his idea that he is the protector of the Palestinians. So he's off to the side on this, even as he claims to be very interested. In practical terms, Qatar, where, of course, many of the Hamas leaders live, as well as in Turkey, was a possible mediator, and indeed has been so on the specific question of the about 250 hostages that Hamas took on October the 7th and continues to hold. Egypt, of course, could be a potential mediator. It certainly has a specific interest in the question of humanitarian aid because of the Rafah crossing, through which much of the aid would pass if we could ever get that agreed on a significant basis. But that Egyptian and Qatari mediation or role, again, is very, very limited, because the fundamental here is that unless you have Israel being willing to agree to a humanitarian pause across all of the Gaza Strip, not just some of it, we're going to be in this position of a continued escalation of violence. And whatever the intentions, whether or not you like the US, like the UK, like Arab states, like Turkey, no one at this point can get traction to be a mediator until Netanyahu and the war cabinet allow them some space to mediate something.
Professor, finally, if a ceasefire doesn't happen and the war drags on, what will be the ramifications to the region and world? Briefly.
I'm just going to say one thing. The ramifications are for those people who are dying every day. We can talk, and I hope we can in a further interview, about the potential of instability between Hezbollah and Israel, where there have been skirmishes on the Lebanese border. We could talk about wider possibilities of conflict with Iran, the backer of Hamas, and Hezbollah. We could talk about the addition to global instability, which is already embroiled in Russia's aggression against Ukraine. But the ramifications, I think we should never forget, is the fact that men, women, and children, entire families, are dying, are being killed before our eyes, and we apparently are powerless to do anything about it until Benjamin Netanyahu and his colleagues decide they've killed enough people.
All right, I've been talking to Professor Scott Lucas, who's the Professor of International Politics at Clinton Institute, University College, Dublin. Professor, thank you very much for talking to us today.
Thank you.
WION is now available in your country. Download the app now and get all the news on the move.